I'm Kathleen Hicks. I direct the International Security Program here at CSIS, and most importantly for today, along with my counterpart, Vice Admiral Pete Daly over at the U.S. Naval Institute, I'm one of the hosts of the Maritime Security Dialogue. Today's discussion is on the return of great power competition and the Second Fleet, featuring Vice Admiral Andrew Woody Lewis. Before we begin today's event, I just want to give you a quick security announcement. We have doors, hopefully you see behind me, on the left and the right. Should a fire alarm or something go off, I will be here in the room with you. I will direct you out of the building. As my boss, John Hamry, likes to say, we have National Geographic down the street, and they have a great Titanic exhibit right now that we can all enjoy while they get us back into the building. The Maritime Security Dialogue, if you aren't familiar with it, is co-hosted by CSIS and the U.S. Naval Institute. It seeks to highlight the current thinking and future challenges facing the United States Navy, the Coast Guard, and the Marine Corps. Our event today is the fourth in our series for 2018. We hope that you're going to join us for future events, and of course we're streaming online and we'll capture the event online. I want to take a moment to especially thank our sponsor, Huntington Ingalls Industries. They support the Maritime Security Dialogue, making the series possible. I'm going to briefly introduce Vice Admiral Lewis. He will come up, give some remarks. We'll then have a little armchair discussion and then open it up to audience Q&A. Vice Admiral Lewis assumed his duties as Commander, U.S. Second Fleet in August of 2018. He previously served as the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Operations Plans and Strategy, the Vice Director for Operations, and Director of Fleet Training at Fleet Forces Command. Vice Admiral Lewis has flown over 100 combat missions in Operations Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Southern Watch, Deny Flight, Enduring Freedom, and Iraqi Freedom. Please join me in a round of applause to welcome Vice Admiral Lewis.
Well, Kat, thanks for the kind introduction, and it's good to see some friendly faces around here. And the ones that I don't know, I look forward to your questions here later on. But it's really good to be here, and thanks to both you and Pete Daly, Kath, for inviting me to speak today. It's an important time for our Navy, and I'm honored to be here to discuss the Second Fleet. Today I want to focus and hopefully answer some of your questions about why Second Fleet was established, what we've been doing since August, and where I see us heading in the future, all within the larger strategic context. As many of you know, I've also been designated as the Commander of Joint Forces Command Norfolk in the NATO command structure. Although I'm here today to talk about Second Fleet, it's important to note the bond and alignment between the two commands. Earlier this year, the Secretary of Defense released the National Defense Strategy, making clear that we're back in an era of great power competition. The establishment of Second Fleet was directed by the Chief of Naval Operations as a result of a changing security environment. Stated simply by Admiral Richardson, Second Fleet is a dynamic response to a dynamic security environment. For the last few decades, our focus was pulled away from the Atlantic to regional threats in the Middle East. However, our leadership recognized that the Atlantic and North Atlantic are critical to maritime security, and that under our former model, we were not poised to best compete in that space. Similarly, in June, NATO defense ministers approved the creation of a new Joint Force Command on the East Coast as part of their NATO command structure adaptation. This new Joint Force Command, with the U.S. as the framework nation and headquartered in Norfolk, Virginia, was established to ensure the alliance is focused on high-end operations in the transatlantic region and northern Atlantic. It's not a coincidence that both commands were created within the same year and that both U.S. and NATO leadership recognize the changing environment in the maritime. We have seen increased activity in the North Atlantic and the Arctic regions, specifically by the Russians and the Chinese, Rivals and adversaries on all fronts and domains have challenged us, and there is undoubtedly an increase in gray zone and hybrid operations. The establishment of Second Fleet is one way our U.S. Navy is mobilizing to meet the demands of the security environment and show our renewed focus on maritime operations and stability in the Atlantic. So what have we been doing since August 24th, when Second Fleet was officially established? Before we were able to effectively build a new fleet that meets the demands of our security environment, it was important first to take the time to fully understand and define the problem we were trying to solve. For most of us, the temptation is often to start fixing things before we truly understand what we're trying to fix. There's great wisdom in Einstein's often quoted adage, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I would spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution. Over the past few months, the last 2 months, my staff has spent a great deal of time thinking about the problem in mission analysis. With clear strategic guidance from the top, our focus was to bring that guidance to the operational level of command in the U.S. Navy that has our numbered fleets. To do so, we focused on learning from our partners, learning from industry, learning from academia, and our leaders, and from our history. The Secretary of Defense has encouraged all of us at all levels of command within the military to engage with our joint counterparts, key leaders and partner nations, as well as industry leaders. As such, my team met with experts, leaders, allies, and partners in order to build relationships up, down, and across the Atlantic. An important first step in the formation of any new command. I personally spoke with leaders in multiple organizations, both government and non-governmental, from technology to think tanks to intelligence and our joint partners, to leverage lessons learned and perspectives. I've also spent a great deal of time meeting with leaders from our partner nations in the Northern Atlantic to ensure our efforts are aligned. Finally, we've looked to other numbered fleets, our U.S. Marine Corps counterparts, our U.S. Coast Guard counterparts, to better understand how we, the fleets, should collectively execute and organize at the operational level of war in order to create a cohesive, credible, and lethal maneuver element across the globe. Meaning, how can we work together to ensure a seamless command and control for force employment? We then turn to history. Second Fleet was originally established in the 1950s as a response to a changing dynamic after World War II, a similar environment that we're in today. That period after World War II marked the end of one war and the beginning of another, the Cold War. My team studied the strategic guidance from this period, the last time the U.S. Navy was truly challenged in the Atlantic, in order to carry forward lessons learned and insight into today, to what Admiral Fogo has aptly named the Fourth Battle of the Atlantic. To avoid simply returning to the Second Fleet of the past, we took all this information gleaned from leaders in history and conducted extensive mission analysis to understand the problem we were trying to fix. We determined three main focus areas. First, there's currently room to improve the command and control structure in the North Atlantic and Arctic region to ensure unity of effort across the maritime domain. And in today's strategic environment, more so than ever, we cannot afford to have blind spots. Second, there's no command structure that allows for a fleet to operate dynamically in accordance with the principles of mission command, nor is there a fleet that has the ability to operate smoothly across the expanse of the Atlantic. And finally, third, there's not been a healthy tension between force generation and force employment, with commands forced to focus on both simultaneously, advocating for one, sometimes at the detriment of the other. Make no mistake, your Navy has been fully executing the mission around the globe under all our operational commands. But with the changing security environment in which we're living today, it was determined that we need to get out ahead of our adversaries. And the reestablishment of Second Fleet is one way we're mobilizing in the Atlantic to do so. So we spent September through October clearly defining the problem. What's next? Today, we're moving out rapidly with a sense of urgency to build a Second Fleet that is fit for its purpose in an organize, man, train, and equip fashion. The rest of my talk will focus on what we are doing in regards to organizing, manning, training, and equipping. We have determined that the mission and focus of Second Fleet will be to develop and dynamically employ maritime forces ready to fight across multiple domains in the Atlantic and the Arctic. Simply put, Second Fleet will focus on forward operations and the employment of forces in the Atlantic. The staff has been organized accordingly, heavy in intelligence, operations, plans, training, logistics, and light and higher headquarters housekeeping functions, those functions that we can tap into Fleet Forces Command and the co-located staff there. What does this mean? And the question everyone has been asking, where will Second Fleet operate? Second Fleet will have 3 mission areas. First, we will operate as a maneuver arm in the Western Atlantic, executing missions such as disaster relief, exercises, and homeland defense. Second, we will operate as a maneuver arm in the Eastern Atlantic, the North Atlantic, and the Arctic in operational missions and exercises like Bolt Ops and the recently conducted Trident Juncture. Third, we will be an advocate for the other operational fleets, the other maneuver arms, as our sailors and Marines prepare to deploy around the world. Our involvement in force generation will be limited to the integrated phase, the final stages of the training cycle, when our ships are operating at the high end in the aggregate. U.S. Fleet Forces Command and U.S. Pacific Fleet will remain and retain certification authority for our deploying forces, with Second and Third Fleet on the West Coast recommendations for deployment, for certification. Now, I've referenced maneuver in all 3 of these mission areas. What I mean by that is, first and foremost, physical maneuver. Maneuver from Norfolk to the north and east across the Atlantic. That's fairly easy to visualize. Also, second aspect of maneuver is maneuver in the spectrum of conflict. Maneuver from peacetime steaming operations to high-end warfare to full-out World War. We have to be able to maneuver in that, and the way we're going to be able to do that is by implementing mission command in the maritime. Third, we will also maneuver in thought. We'll utilize our newest technologies in the digital world to change the way we execute under mission command. At the force development level, there's a need to push the envelope when it comes to conceptual and technical development. Along with other fleet commanders, specifically Third Fleet, we will work closely with our warfare development centers to provide a testing ground for new concepts and developments to further our advantage over adversaries. Earlier, I spoke about turning to our history to grow as a fleet. I recently read Trent Hone's Learning War, which delves into the way the Navy developed its doctrine from 1898 to 1945. Think about how successful the Navy was during that period. at fostering and promoting a culture of innovation that included the development of the Combat Information Center on board ships. We're driving to that standard of innovation. Innovation in technology and digital world will act as my weapon system as a fleet commander to communicate and execute mission orders throughout the fleet. Technology is only one component of innovation. The rest is the ingenuity of our sailors and the open-mindedness our commanders have to trying new things. The strategic environment is forcing us to rethink how we operate. For example, I heard Margie Palmero from our digital warfare office in the Pentagon say that she hopes to see a time when a sailor can see a problem on a mission, write an app to address it, and push it out to sailors and other units in a matter of days. I don't think that's a far stretch. We as commanders have the responsibility to foster that environment. That's the kind of thinking that Second Fleet has been charged and designed to do. Speaking of sailors and Marines, we have gotten many questions about manning of our team, and it certainly is a primary focus of my staff. We're recruiting the best and the brightest. Second Fleet will be lean and agile in order to carry out a mission. We're growing every day, but we're less focused on the actual number of people, but rather on the effectiveness and efficiency of the staff that is organized around the mission. Integration with our other fleets and partner nations will be crucial to the execution of our mission. In addition to the U.S. complement, we are looking to integrate non-U.S. coalition members to our team for diversity of thought, expertise, and depth of network as we continue to build our organization to work with partners and allies across the Atlantic. Integration in warfare is about the ability of our teams, human teams and human machine teams, to operate seamlessly in conditions of uncertainty and complexity. That takes technology to help share data and process some of the cognitive load, but it also requires innovation in how we fight, concept of operations, training techniques and procedures that give our teams an advantage over an adversary. At present, we are laser focused on training our team to operate seamlessly in those conditions of uncertainty and complexity in order to command and control forces as we work towards operational capability. To do this, we're implementing a robust training plan to ensure our team is prepared. There's no instruction or model for standing up a fleet, I've found, but we're going to create it. Pulling from Navy doctrine, my team is creating a training syllabus similar to that of an air wing exercise. Most of you know that I am an aviator. I spent some time out in Fallon, Nevada, like Mark Fox did, commanding Top Gun and some other organizations out there. And we have a pretty good system for training at the air wing level, pretty good system at the strike group level, but we don't have it at the fleet level, the Fleet Maritime Operations Center. That's what we're driving to work toward. We're pulling from Navy doctrine, and we're pulling also from our mock training teams, our Maritime Operations Center training teams in preparation for future command and control exercises as well as real-world operations. There will be no single source training. We'll leverage expertise from across the force, from our warfare development centers, our Maritime Operations Center training teams, the Naval War College, Naval Postgraduate School, training carrier strike groups, intelligence communities, the other numbered fleets, and many more. This is going to be an all-hands effort. I'm putting my team to the test to ensure we are ready to fight. Finally, we're looking at options to equip the Second Fleet with a platform that allows us to show that we are indeed lean, agile, and expeditionary. For the foreseeable future, the Second Fleet will be located at Naval Support Activity Hampton Roads, But we are looking at options for both permanent and expeditionary spaces that would allow for flexibility and mobility. This could be a combination of facilities at Naval Station Norfolk, as well as options for a command ship through our Military Sealift Command. Mobility allows us to be ready to fight so we don't have to. As a lean and expeditionary staff, a small number of our team will operate forward, either from a ship or an austere location, as a command and control element with reach-back capability to our home guard. What is our timeline for this? We are driving the team to reach full operational capability in 2019, with Joint Force Command following closely behind. We will conduct operations in the North Atlantic at the high end of naval warfare, maneuvering dynamically and within all domains. In closing, my team is lean, agile, and most importantly, operationally focused. We are growing swiftly in capacity and capability. In opening, I mentioned that this is an important time for your Navy. Make no mistake that it is. We have the opportunity, in fact, the imperative, to act, to mobilize, and to meet the demands of the current security environment. We are building a fleet from scratch, and we have the unique chance to make it different, to make it right, to make it fit for its time, to make it fit for its purpose. We will do so, and we'll be prepared to fight, ready to fight so they don't have to. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Turns on, yes. Everything's automated. All right. Well, thank you very much, Admiral Lewis. Really interesting set of issues you raise in your opening remarks, and I'm sure the audience will want to get into a number of them alongside me. Let's start on the priority set, which I was very not surprised, but heartened to hear how operationally focused you're trying to keep. It's clear you're trying to keep your team thinking in that direction. But you mentioned right at the outset the challenge between force generation, force employment, and much of what you described about that it takes to become operational, the experimentation, the exercises, the investment of time and training, that takes forces. So that would be my first question. What's your comfort level, confidence level with your ability to husband, if you will, capacity forces in order to undertake the kinds of experimentation and exercises that are critical to advancing the operational concepts?
I'm actually very comfortable, and because my critical path to operational capability is being able to command and control forces. So what that simply means is I get forces assigned to me in which they work for me and tactically in a region in which I have to be able to command and control. My staff has to be able to command and control those forces and synchronize their efforts and provide domain awareness and so on and so forth. Very comfortable with doing it. And what my training syllabus is going to be focused on is that laser focused on that here in the near term. We're starting in this, going into a training environment. We have the unique opportunity to do that without a lot of other pressures early in the new year. We'll have enough people on board. We'll have about 80 people on board on the staff by the end of January to go into this training. And we'll focus on that for about 2 months time frame, in which there'll be forces assigned to me that are going through the latter stages of their workup, specifically a strike group that is getting ready to deploy, and we'll be able to go through that process of them working up and experimentation as they go through. It'll be challenged, but it'll be a lot of fun, actually.
Well, it's hard to think about Second Fleet, the Atlantic maritime environment, and not, at least for me, jump immediately to ASW. So I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about how you think, where the Navy is with ASW. I think it is commonly viewed that the Navy has, at least since 2011, but probably since the end of the Cold War, really allowed ASW to become a lesser priority. Seems now it needs to be a higher priority. Second Fleet seems to be one of the locations in the world where that becomes incredibly important. Can you talk a little bit about how you're thinking about ASW as that fits into your priorities?
Very high.
That's reassuring.
I mean, some other things that have happened, that are happening in regards to anti-submarine warfare on the East Coast, and this is an eye toward Russia. I mean, let's be frank here. The Russian undersea threat is real, and they are very competent. They're very operationally capable, and we are, in addition to Second Fleet being reestablished, there is a submarine group that has been reestablished under Admiral Chaz Richard, who is the submarine force commander on the East Coast. We are in lockstep from a standpoint of mission focus, because those high-end naval operations really start in the Atlantic and the North Atlantic in anti-submarine warfare, undersea warfare. And it's an area that we're really, really focused on across the force, across the Navy, not just in the submarine community, but in the surface community and the aviation community and the entire spectrum of all the domains.
Yeah, and from an enterprise perspective, I would have to imagine thusly that naval intelligence and improvements in naval intelligence, which is the bedrock for everything, but certainly ASW highly dependent on improved naval intelligence. Is that a priority area for Second Fleet?
Very much so.
Yep.
One of the things that, well, first of all, one of the things that, one of the first things I did was identify my intelligence officer, who is also, he's dual-hatted as my deputy operations officer, essentially. And this is the model that Admiral Fox used at Fifth Fleet that I've adopted, in which, because of that fusion of operations and intel. But first, one of the first principles of mission command is domain awareness. And to develop that domain awareness and tap into all the ability to see the environment and focus the environment on it. We've got a lot of work to do there, but we're really focused on it. Is the long pole in the tent, sorry, I can't think of a better way to frame that right now, having the personnel, having the people who are focused on the Russia maritime challenge set? Is it training? What would you say on the naval intelligence side is the biggest challenge for you? I think there's an element of the number of personnel that are focused on. There's still we have had, the intelligence community writ large had shifted over the last couple of decades, more to a counterterrorism focus, but there's certainly an element within naval intelligence, certainly, that has stayed focused in the maritime domain, stayed focused in the undersea, but its capacity is lacking a little bit, and we're trying to build that capacity. I also think that there's an element of tapping into artificial intelligence and machine learning, in which we're starting to make some inroads in there, but it's not going as quickly as we need it to go to really provide that OODA loop, getting it quick, get a tighter OODA loop in our domain awareness. And like Fifth Fleet, you're in a region in which you're dealing with not only multiple ints, but you're dealing with a variety of allies, partners, different levels of clearance, certainly for undersea, different levels of understanding of the capabilities and capacity intelligence that each brings. Then you have sort of private actors, et cetera. As you look at that maritime domain awareness challenge set, what's highest on your list there? Is it the naval intelligence people? Is it, for instance, sensors? Is it taking what we have now and experimenting with it? Is it working through the JFC
the soon-to-be JFC structure?
I think it's all of the above, to be honest with you, but there is very much a recognition by not just our military leadership, our nation's leadership, but also our partners, coalition, and allies, that we've got to get back in this space, and we've got to really get back into it with a bullseye focus. Specific, like you and I were talking earlier about, there are several allied countries that I'm pulling into the Second Fleet staff. My proposal is to pull in several countries that have not liaison officers, but actually have staff members on the U.S. Second Fleet that are regionally focused in the Atlantic, North Atlantic, and into the Arctic.
Right. Let's maybe talk a little about some of the other challenge areas. You mentioned gray zone hybrid. We do know, of course, the Russians very adept at finding ways to create ambiguity, circumvent thresholds, and that can include in the maritime domain. What are the areas there where you might be looking? Again, I'm not trying to ask you to get into areas you shouldn't be talking about, but for instance, we've at CSIS before done some research on the fact that the Russians are really interested in containerized missiles and things of that sort that could be carried on the maritime domain. Where do those kinds of hybrid, for lack of a better term, threats rank inside the numerous priorities that you're going to have? Is that a big issue in Second Fleet's jurisdiction, or are you more concerned on those deep sea ASW kind of threats?
I think so. If you recall, when I was trying to characterize in my description of maneuver, so maneuver across the spectrum of conflict. So everything from just steaming along and making sure things are safe in the maritime environment, all the way to fighting a world war at sea, or fighting a major conflict at sea, and so the Russians are adept at their staying in that region that below where we get a NAC declaration,
yes,
or for that's something that gets everybody going, and so they operate in that space pretty well. We have heretofore been somewhat reactive rather than proactive. So what we're doing, and what the national defense strategy is really driving us toward, is developing a way of operating in which we can be operationally unpredictable to our competitors while being strategically predictable to ourselves and our allies and friends. For example, dynamic force employment, which I'm sure everybody is familiar with. So what does that mean, in the context of what we're talking about here? So the Truman Strike Group deployed earlier this year, went for a planned 6-7 month deployment, and we changed it all and made it a bit different. And what they ended up doing was doing a short deployment, doing a mid-deployment port call, which happened to be in Norfolk, Virginia, and then they redeployed to where operationally the Russians didn't know where they were going, and so as to impose cost, and they ended up participating in Trident Juncture along with 50,000 of their best friends, and which was caused some consternation, I believe, and imposed some cost on the Russians, which is what an example of dynamic force employment in action, I guess.
I'm going to go to the audience in a second for questions, but I do want to ask you to speak a little further on the Arctic, because that's a domain that didn't exist the way it does today when there was last a Second Fleet. and again, your expanse of ocean is very large. So how do you weigh in to those priorities, thinking through the Arctic and maybe especially, again, domain awareness and even the undersea challenges that the Arctic can present?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things in my personal education program I've been going through over the last couple of months, some people I've talked to specifically that I think have good knowledge in the Arctic, certainly more than I do. The United States Coast Guard, the Canadian forces, the Norwegians. Speaking to some of the other Arctic nations, Iceland, for example, and their perspective is much more, they have a lot more specific knowledge on what's going on in the Arctic. And what I'm trying to do is understand what I don't know, mm-hmm. and what we don't know, and then digging into that and starting to really get a better domain awareness, mm-hmm. in accordance with a strategy that we are in the process of writing, that the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Coast Guard are in the process of writing. But that's a big thing to look after.
Yeah, and you mentioned, I think in your comments, that's Russia, but also China, obviously, is a player in the Arctic, probably much more so than the rest of your AOR. Are you thinking about both of those players and their implications for?
Without a doubt. Yeah. I mean, the Chinese, aspirationally are in the Arctic. The Russians are in the Arctic.
Yes.
And not just from a search and rescue standpoint, but from militarily in the Arctic. And there's no question that the logical sequence of events with the Chinese will be there militarily as well. And so we have got to be in there in a way, at least understand what we need to be doing, so as to be able to operate there where it could be a competitive space in the future. I would not say it is there yet, mm-hmm. but it's certainly something that we need to develop our awareness of much more than we have to this point.
Great. Okay, I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions. So we have microphones that will come around. If you raise your hand and I call on you, please stand, give your name, your affiliation if you have one. It's a question, one question that ends with a question mark. So, any questions? We'll start right up here.
I'm Harlan Ullman. Admiral, thank you. Good to see you again. My question is, how are you considering conceptually dealing with joint and combined operations, as well as your interactions with the 4th, 6th, 10th Fleets and NAVUR, in terms of what you see as your concept of operations and how you integrate all the things that are going to be essential that cannot be limited only to naval forces?
Good to see you again, sir. Jeff Harvey gave me a heads up you'd be here, so so I referenced 2nd Fleet as a maneuver arm. So if you consider Nav North as part of NORTHCOM, so the naval component for NORTHCOM is Nav North and has 2 maneuver arms. 2nd Fleet on the East Coast and 3rd Fleet on the West Coast. NAVUR, as the naval component for EUCOM, has 2 maneuver arms, 6th Fleet and 2nd Fleet. So in a supporting relationship standpoint of those two maneuver arms, where this is on a U.S. hat standpoint. That's how we operate. Now to transition or to align with JFC Norfolk. So JFC Norfolk is the whole Atlantic under SACUR. There's 3 JFCs, geographic JFCs, JFC Brunson, JFC Naples in the south, and JFC Norfolk in the Atlantic. So as maneuver arm in the Atlantic, along with other maritime forces, MARCOM, Sixth Fleet or Striking Force NATO, Second Fleet / JFC Norfolk, and that hat would be a maneuver arm. So it's all, it's two separate commands, two separate staffs. The only dual-hatted person is me, but there is an easy transition and alignment between JFC Norfolk and Second Fleet and the coalition, the alliance, and the partners that are associated with both of them. And that is something that is an absolute imperative as far as I'm concerned, because if I get out of alignment, Second Fleet into JFC Norfolk, I'll never get them back. So I've got to start off that way. That's the approach I've taken.
Can I assume that's also something that's part of you'll be routinely exercising, if you will,
Yes,
the
ma'am.
C2 arrangements?
Well, Second Fleet is going to be the Officer and Tactical Command during BALT-OPS in June of 2019, which is it's actually not a NATO exercise, but it's done with NATO forces. Mm-hmm. It's a European command exercise. It's normally conducted and in Tactical Command is normally Striking Force NATO, which is dual-hatted with Sixth Fleet.
Right.
And so this year, the Sixth Fleet, or NAVUR, is the officer conducting the exercise in Navy terms, and the officer in Tactical Command will be Second Fleet.
Right.
So that's an example of that as an exercise. And that's, in the greater context of not just U.S. exercises, but NATO exercises, which is something that General Scaparrotti has laid out pretty clearly in his focus.
Okay, I know we had a question way back in the back here. Yep.
Heather Conley with CSIS. Thank you so much, Admiral. Two questions. Any reflection on the Trident Juncture exercise, what you thought, what surprised you, what did not surprise you? And secondly, you mentioned digitalization as an important mission command. We saw through Trident Juncture Russian jamming of GPS. We see electronic warfare in Ukraine. How are you building in resilience to those tactics?
She asked two.
You asked two questions.
I think she violated my rules as a dear colleague. So you may use your discretion. If you're feeling especially generous to CSIS, you can answer both.
Okay, I'll take it. Okay, so the initial reflections on Trident Juncture. I think most of what we are gathering from lessons in that, I think we kind of knew. Because we're getting back into a geographic space in a time of year, and we haven't been operating that way for a long, long time. We've been operating in the Persian Gulf, where it's like a lake, and it's really hot, whereas now we're operating up off the coast of Norway, where it's blowing a gale, the decks are moving around, the ships are getting beat up, and people are getting beat up. We're not used to being out on the flight deck for long periods of time where it's really cold. And our kids, they adapt really quickly, but not without repeat efforts. So that, I think most of it's been that those lessons, those kind of lessons, and I think overall we did pretty well, but we can do better. In regards to the
cyber and EW.
The cyber EW piece, we are well prepared, and we deal with that. I think of it in terms of where we need to be able to be operating is we need to be able to have assured comms, assured communications that we're confident. What we would call a thin line, and we have to be able to have that, and we will, and we do, but we have to be really understand where that thin line is, and then be able to communicate mission orders across that thin line in accordance with commander's intent. And so individual commanders on the high seas can operate independently somewhat so they, unless otherwise directed, here's what I intend to do, which is something that the Navy has historically, traditionally done very well. Sometimes in our recent past, we have pulled back from that a little bit, or allowed ourselves to pull back from that a little bit. So we need to that trust we have with subordinate commanders and amongst themselves is really, really important. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the closest I'm going to come.
And we'll do this in second in the row here.
Good morning, Commodore Admiral. God save the Queen. Uncle Sam has succeeded in getting the supremacy of the international sea because the British have already retreated from their empire. But you're right to mention about the Russians. The Russians are nowhere near the United States Navy because they don't have an open sea. Geographically, they don't have an open sea, unlike the Chinese. But because the Chinese have got an open sea and they had about 4,000 years of history, there is a problem at the moment where they have been building structures on islands that are contested.
Is there a question?
Because international law has no enforcement performance. That's the difficulty. So I'm wondering, Commodore, whether you could advise the situation at the moment, how China could strategically get to a position where they can deal with this problem without getting into war.
Would you like to advise the Chinese Navy on how they should operate in a vast open environment?
I'll just say the existential threat, or no, let me back up. Since 1945, the international waters, international airspace has been, we have been operating, all countries, all nations have been operating with due regard, in accordance with international norms, in accordance with a rules base in which we respect those ways of operating. The threat to that at present is what the Chinese are doing in the South China Sea. They're trying to build out their territorial space illegally, which is not in accordance with international norms, and we're not going to allow it. The international, the alliance that has been led since 1945 by the United States will continue to be led by the United States, and will not allow it. We will ensure that we retain freedom of the seas, freedom of navigation, freedom of trade, which has made the world a much safer and a much more prosperous place since in the last 70 years.
Now that does raise the question, I guess, of how it's going with our incidents at sea arrangement with the Russians. So that was an arrangement made in the early 70s with the Soviet Union. It's been renewed, refreshed, discussed every year. There's Navy-to-Navy relations on that. Is that within the purview? Will that be a Second Fleet responsibility to maintain that relationship with the Russians? And do you feel that they are at least currently abiding by anything that's contained within that agreement as it relates to the Second Fleet area?
So presently, the INCSE is run under Admiral Fogo and CSIS Navyur, and in close coordination with the CNO staff. And I don't know what that will be in the future. It may be come back to CNO staff. I don't know, but presently that's how it is. In regards to the Russians adhering, there's been a number of INC violations, a number of incidents in which the Russians were either acting unprofessionally or unsafely, or both. And we go through the normal diplomatic process in which we call them out on it. And there's an annual INC conference, and anything like that, cues with the Chinese
Sure,
is a similar type of agreement in which anything like that reinforces professional behavior at sea, professional behavior in the air, is absolutely a good thing, and something that we're about deterring. We're about reducing the friction from miscalculation, all those kind of things. We're the last ones that want to get in a fight. But we're going to be ready for it.
Okay. Let's see. I've got questions on a couple of these. I want to go back over here. Let's see. I'm sorry, young lady, I think I can't quite see you. Yes, right there.
Hi, thank you, sir. Mallory Shelbourne with Inside Defense. The high-end operational training plan for early 2019, I was wondering if you could talk about what that entails, and you mentioned getting to full operational capability in 2019, and if you could talk about what you need to achieve that goal.
Okay, so the training plan, we're going to start going through what I would call a combined air wing readiness program, or a squadron readiness program, and an air wing Fallon, and a surface group sail, and a Comp 2X exercise, all rolled into one at the operational level. And we're starting in February. So we're going to be using part of the facility at Fleet Forces Command as our operational headquarters, with the continuity, with communication and all the situational awareness tools. And we'll be going through, exercises that are generated by the Maritime Operations Center training team, also generated by the Navy Warfighting Development Command, also in conjunction with a carrier strike group that is going through their training prior to the deployment. We're going to roll that up into one exercise, and while we're going to have that training plan built, we're kind of building the tricycle as we go, I guess. But we've got Combined Task Force 80, which is Fleet Forces Command, with oversight of my staff as we get through it. What we need to get to, the second part of your question is, what we need to get between initial operating capability and final operating capability is just capacity. It's all because the critical path, I think I mentioned this earlier, the critical path to initial operating capability is in order to be able to command and control forces in the maritime. So it's really just a matter of being able to do that 24 hours a day. And that's the only difference. And I've got a good plan for people coming on board to meet that in 2019. There's an operational imperative, which I'm not going to talk about here, but there's an operational imperative that we need to be in that space. We need to be ready to go in 2019.
Okay, we're going to take one last question. I have one all the way in the back over here.
Good morning, sir. Thank you for your remarks and your insights today. My name is Dinas Butners, Georgetown University. You mentioned ball tops. You mentioned the challenges of operating with partners and getting back into the North Atlantic. Given that you are an aviator, can you talk a little bit about the challenges with Kaliningrad, and what does Russia's A2AD or anti-access area denial look like for Second Fleet? Thank you. I think that, well, I guess
without going into,
Things you shouldn't talk
yeah,
about here.
something I shouldn't talk about. But I'm confident that we can operate in an A2 AD environment, and I'm in a contested environment. In fact, I know we can. I know we can with our carrier force. I know we can with our surface force, and we have a very clear way of doing that. It is based upon maneuver. It's based upon physical maneuver. It's based upon maneuver in the spectrum, and it's based upon our ability to keep quiet when it's time to keep quiet and talk when it's time to talk. And that's something that we're really, really focused on, and we have been focused on for a number of years now, and we're getting a lot better. We still need to improve, but we're getting a lot better. So I'm confident we can get there.
Well, Admiral Lewis, I want to thank you for your time today, for your leadership at Second Fleet, for getting us back into the North Atlantic in a thoroughgoing and advanced way. Please join me in a round of applause for Admiral Lewis. Thank you
Thanks,
very much.
Jeff.